Hi guys, and welcome back to LPJ Models. In this video I'm going to be building the Wingnut Wings 1/32 scale Sopwith Snipe Late. This kit was sent to me by a patron to build, and I really appreciate it, thank you, and I hope you love the end result. Anyway, let's get stuck right in with the build. The parts were removed from their sprues with my GODHAND single blade sprue cutters. These give a really crisp cut, and on flat parts means there's minimal cleanup. Anyway, as you'd expect, the work begins in the cockpit. Here I'm starting by cleaning up any excess sprue nubs or seam lines on any of the parts. To do this I usually use a 10A scalpel paired with some sanding sticks or some sandpaper. The control column is missing some detail on the grip. To replicate this, I use some 0.2mm lead wire glued in place with VMS Flexi 5K superglue. Once the wire was glued in place, it was wrapped carefully around the handle. There were two switches on the instrument panel that I thought could use some aftermarket treatment. So for this I drilled in some holes and dropped in some of my Ennie's print at home knobs and switches. I used these extensively on my Zero build and I think they're great. Because Wingnut Wings kits are so sub-assembly heavy, it didn't take long before I had to start painting something. All of the cockpit components were primed with Mr. Mahogany Surfacer 1500. This was thinned around 60% paint to 40% Mr. Leveling Thinner. The ammo boxes were painted with ALCLAD aluminium straight over the Mr. Surfacer. And the panel itself was given a layer of MRP pale wood. This was sprayed straight out of the bottle and it went down really smooth. The fuel tanks were painted in a service grey, but I wanted to chip them first, so I based them in ALCLAD aluminium before coating them in some VMS chipping fluid. For the darker tones of the service grey, I used MRP Extra Dark Sea Grey. And for the actual grey, I used a custom mix of MRP colours. I started with some US light grey and then added some white and extra dark sea grey to homogenise the tones. This highlight colour was then built up over the fuel tanks, allowing some of the dark grey to still show through. Once the paint was dried, I used some warm water to gently chip away some of the paint. This activates the chipping fluid underneath, lifting off small flakes of paint to show the aluminium underneath. Now it's time for one of my favourite things to do, and that's some wood grain. Over a coat of MRP pale wood, I brushed a mix of raw sienna and burnt umber artist oils. This was mixed with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light to help the paint to flow better. If you want to see an in-depth tutorial on how to paint wood grain with oils, I've got you covered. There's a link in the description below. Once the thinner had evaporated out, I used a slightly stiff brush to brush some grain marks into the oil paint. There was lots of metalwork to paint on the interior. Most of these details were picked out with either Vallejo or Darkstar metallic colours. Here I'm using Darkstar pewter to pick out the bracket for the throttle quadrant, and the pipework was done with Vallejo copper. A fine brush really helps when picking out detail like this. I always like to use a 2-0 Kolinsky sable. To add some depth and shading to the cockpit, I applied several oil washes. For the metal areas, I used Abteilung 502 Sepia. For the wooden areas, I used a burnt umber artist oil, which is a slightly warmer tone, giving it a richer look. The Wingnut Wings cockpit details were perfectly registered and beautifully detailed. They were set in place with VMS decals set and fixed. The decals were dipped in warm water for a second and set aside. When they were loose from the backing paper, they were slid carefully into place. With most of the interior paintwork done, it was time to start bringing some of those details together. The glue I'm using for all of the plastic parts is VMS Styrene Cement Fast. There was one detail left before I could really start bringing the cockpit together properly, and that was the seatbelts. Usually I'd go for some HGW fabric ones, but I stuck with the photo etch ones supplied in the kit this time. They were annealed for a few seconds over a tea light, and then bent carefully into shape. I had to be really gentle here so as not to damage the underlying paint. Once I was happy with the shape, they were painted in situ. For the lighter areas I used Vallejo German Camouflage Beige, and for the darker areas Vallejo Leather Brown. Now I can start bringing the cockpit together properly. The machine guns were given a base coat of Mr. Hobby GX2 Gloss Black. This is ultra shiny and it was thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner. For the gunmetal colour, I mixed up some ALCLAD gunmetal, steel and a tiny drop of MRP black. I don't make it easy for myself, but the ALCLAD gunmetal has got a very purple sheen to it, and it didn't really suit the look I was going for here. Once this was dry, to emulate some worn metallic edges, I dry brushed over some Mr. Metal Colour Dark Iron. This is a buffable metallic paint and it looks really cool. With the cockpit assembly complete, it was time to mount it to the fuselage sides. The glue was carefully scraped away from the mating points, and I applied some extra thin and some super glue just for some reinforcement. Once the glue was applied, it was pushed carefully into place. The other fuselage half was then glued in place over the top. To make sure the joins were secure and solid, I ran some extra glue over them, just to make sure. The fuselage coaming was then just carefully pressed into place for now. The engine assembly was really simple and it came out really nicely detailed. Some of the separate parts allowed for a lot more detail and realism, but the part count was still reasonably low. I added some spark plug wiring to the engine with some INFINI model 1/32 scale aero rigging wire. These wires were carefully glued in place with VMS superglue. The whole engine was given a layer of Mr. Colour GX2 before being based in some ALCLAD steel. I then used a mix of ALCLAD steel and MRP burnt iron to add some shading and heat staining to the engine. I also added a few small areas of ALCLAD pale burnt metal, but I did this off camera. I added some final highlights with ALCLAD aluminium. The whole engine was then given a wash with Absolute 502 sepia. Not only did this make it look nice and oily, but it also picked out all the shadows. With all the internals done, it was time to start focusing on the paint for the outside of the aircraft. The whole aircraft was primed in Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. I then masked off all the ribs with masking tape, and for the undersides, I used MRP white to pick out these highlights. Once the ribs had been painted, I infilled some of the centre sections with the same colour. This will make up the basis for the highlights on the bottom. Once this was complete, it was time to start thinking about the markings. I won't be using the kit decals. Instead, Ivan from the Plastic Posse podcast kindly cut me some on his silhouette cutter. Thanks Ivan, I really appreciate it. Ivan does amazing work and he's got a Facebook page called 310s Model Works. I highly recommend you check it out and give him a like. And also don't forget to check out the Plastic Posse podcast. Brilliant modelling content, and if you go back a fair few episodes, there's even an interview with me on there. For the black stars, as you probably gathered by now, I'm using MRP black. This is being built up very lightly so as not to obscure any of the shading detail. And once this was dry, the stars were put carefully into place. Before I could carry on with the underside colour, I had to reinstate some of those highlights. For the main linen colour on the underside, I used MRP Clear Dope Linen V2. Once again, this was built up really lightly so as not to obscure that highlight detail underneath. Do you know what's really satisfying? Peeling off paint masks. Nice, I'm really pleased with how these turned out. Let's do some more masking. The white background for the spade was sprayed with MRP Clear Dope Linen V1. It's closer to a tan than a white, but a white would have looked way too stark. Once this had dried, the mask was carefully put into place. This did take a few tries to make it level, but I got there in the end. With everything pressed down, everything was given a layer of MRP black. One of the things that's missing on the underside is a bit more texture in the finish. So for the upper sides, I used a metal ushi stencil just to add some more range and more texture. For this highlight colour, I used MRP Clear Dope Linen V2. I think a white would just push the contrast on the green too much. And now it's time for the top colour. For the green, I used a mix of Olive Grün and PC10, both MRP colours. Because this aircraft was likely recovered, I didn't want to use straight PC10, so I mixed in some Olive Grün, just to make the green look a bit different. And again, this was built up in really light layers. And when this section of green was complete, it was time to peel away that paint mask. Great success. For the upper wings, I followed the same method I used for the underside, apart from that one added step of using an ushi stencil to add a bit more texture. In my notes it said I used MRP black here, but looking at it, it doesn't look like a pure black. I must have cut it with something, just to tone it down. Once again, the green was applied lightly and carefully. I don't want to cover up all of that hard work. The front cowl and combing were painted with ALCLAD aluminium. The final colour is going to be grey, but I wanted to chip them. So after the aluminium was dry, they were given a layer of VMS chipping medium. These areas were then painted in the same way as the fuel tank, with MRP Extra Dark Sea Grey overlaid with my custom light grey mix. I'm really liking how this is looking. Hopefully the chipping will bring it to the next level. Or that's what I would say if I didn't know what was about to happen. When gluing the combing to the fuselage, I had a bit of a disaster. The combing wasn't fitting properly, even after numerous dry fits, so I tried taping it in place, and I ended up with a seam line that looked like a 1/35th scale weld. And the masking tape pulled off loads of the grey paint, leaving the aluminium showing through. Needless to say, for a few minutes I wasn't very happy at all. But adapt and overcome. First off, I had to fix that disgusting seam. Effectively, I sanded it as smooth as I could, and also tried to sand in some of those peeled off aluminium edges. To fix the seam, I filled it first with some sprue goo. This is effectively sprue dissolved in extra thin cement. And because it effectively is plastic, it behaves exactly the same way as the plastic on the kit. Once this was applied, I left it aside to dry for 24 hours. I then brought out the big guns, some high grit sanding sticks. I sanded everything smooth to make sure it would blend in nicely. It's quite a good idea to spray a light layer of paint in between sanding coats. This way you'll flag up any imperfections that you might have missed. I moved through the grades of sandpaper, getting finer as I went. This helps to eliminate any scratches that were left by the coarser grades. And once I was happy with the finish, I re-scribed the panel lines with a CMK razor saw. This took several passes and a brush of extra thin just to smooth everything over. I re-added some of the detail I'd sanded away with some stretched sprue. It's by no means a perfect job, but I think it came out pretty well. Once I was happy with the repair, everything was painted as before. But I'm not going to be chipping it. I think I've pushed my luck with this section quite far enough. With the repair complete, I can now happily move on, and the next step, after gluing the engine in place, was the weathering. I added some stains and splatters on the underside with Abteilung 502 sepia. This was applied in lines with a very fine sable brush, and then blended with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. You can also see some mud and dirt. This was just brushed and speckled on artist oil colours. Burnt umber, yellow ochre and white. I also added some oil splashes with Abteilung 502 sepia. This was speckled on with an old brush. The struts were painted and then glued in place with my fast-setting styrene cement. This is always a part on First World War aircraft models that I kind of dread. It's so easy to slip up. With the struts glued to the lower wing, I pressed the upper wing into place. This wasn't glued at this time. It took me a little while to align each strut with its allocated hole. I really need to get a jig or something. Anyway, once the upper wing was temporarily in place, the model was placed down on the corner of its box. This was to make sure the wings stayed true whilst the struts were drying. And once the struts were dried, it was time to start the rigging. For this I used INFINI model 1/32 scale aero rigging wire with VMS superglue. I've done a fair amount of rigging so I'm comfortable with it, but it's still quite a nerve-wracking task. What's missing from this video is the footage of me trying time and time again to get the rigging wire into the hole and failing. The footage for this is effectively a best of, but it shows you how I did it. The rest of the rigging wires were glued onto the upper wing. And then it was time to glue the upper wing into place. I applied glue to the top of all of the struts. I usually work fairly quickly, so I thought this would be okay. I thought that setting the struts, like I showed you previously, against the side of the box would make sure they'd line up perfectly. But that wasn't the case. It took me ages to get the upper wing into place. I had to be careful so that I didn't get glue everywhere. And I also had to be careful to make sure I didn't damage anything. In the end, I had to take it away from the workbench and wrangle it in several different positions to get them to fit. But I got there in the end. And to make sure everything was secure, I used some bottles from the bench just to weigh them down to make sure they bonded properly. And the rigging wires were glued in place in the same way as before. A dot of super glue, stretch, hold, and hopefully I can take the tweezers away and it will be stuck in place. Sometimes this does take a few seconds to dry though, so it is a game of patience. The landing gear was then glued onto the bottom of the fuselage. The propeller was painted grey with a central wooden section. The grey was painted as before masking off and spraying a tan section and then painting in some lamination lines with acrylics. I then added some oil wood grain for authenticity. And for the final step, I added some mud splashes to the wheels, just to blend the weathering in. And with that, the build was complete. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my supporters on Patreon for supporting the channel. You guys are awesome and I really appreciate the support. I'd also like to give a huge thanks to the patron who sent me this kit to build. I hope you enjoyed it. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.